Hello there. Welcome to our week 4 review. Let's go ahead and jump right into it. As soon as I click right. There we go. What factors do you think may have influenced the presence and form of slavery in a society? A lot of people had great ideas as far as this goes. And like I said, if you look at most large agricultural based societies throughout history, a lot of them form some form of slavery. Not all of them, but a lot of them do. But as I pointed out in the PowerPoint, really the form of it, the character it takes, the rigidity of it, the way it's institutionalized, and really kind of the ill effects and the brutality of it really differ to some degree depending on when and where you're looking at, whether it, and also I guess kind of the end intent is really what ultimately ends up having a big influence as well on the form that slavery ends up taking. If you're thinking about slavery being used as a form simply to increase population numbers, if you're thinking about slavery being used more for domestic purposes, if you're thinking about slavery being used for educational purposes or to fill jobs within a government or a bureaucratic type class, if you're thinking about slavery as a form of fulfilling soldiers and people to go out and fight for you, all of these really influence the way that enslaved individuals are perceived within society, the role and function that they make up, and ultimately how they are treated. Obviously, slaves which are being used for manual labor are oftentimes treated the least good, the harshest. Of course, sexual labor kind of goes hand in hand with that. Kind of the next step up, I would say, generally in treatment would be domestic servants, although oftentimes these borderlines can be mixed. Often, if they're going to be fulfilling roles more as far as government officials or bureaucrats, they usually have a slightly higher level than within society. And usually, if you're relying upon a slave army to protect your civilization, typically those enslaved individuals form a relatively high level within the social stratus of your society. And that oftentimes, if you look at groups such as the Janissaries or the Mamluks, they ultimately had it better than the vast majority of the population. They still had to fight. They couldn't fulfill any other kind of role within society besides being a soldier, but ultimately it was a relatively kind of high-ranking position within the government. So really the form and what enslaved individuals were expected to do plays a pretty significant role in how they are ultimately treated and how the entire system is kind of set up. Also, you have to look at pretty much how similar or different the group of enslaved individuals is to those who are enslaving them. If it's a situation where a cultural group is generally enslaving its own people, they're generally treated a little bit better. If it's a situation where there's some very clear divides culturally between one group and another, whether that comes down to language, ethnicity, or race-based slavery, a lot of times, once more, there are much clearer distinctions between enslaved groups and the free groups within the society. There's usually much harsher treatment for groups which are more different than the dominant group within the society, or with the rather than the minority groups within the society, and that a lot of that also factors into kind of the form and the presence that slavery takes. Also, ultimately, how much of a society's economy is based around an institution of slavery. How important is it? There have been plenty of societies, like I said, where slavery was present, but it wasn't a huge component. Being filled usually in those cases more for kind of domestic servant roles, maybe some agricultural roles, perhaps some labor roles, but not roles that were pretty much of kind of monumental economic importance to kind of the civilization, which was enslaving these individuals. And it seems like if there's not as much of a need or as much of a kind of tie to economics, the treatment of those individuals is better. There's a much better chance that they're going to be freed at some point in time in their lifetime. And there's a much higher chance then that their children are not going to be kind of enslaved, and it's not going to become a hereditary system. And we'll be talking about this a little bit more in the next question, but really the hereditary system which develops in the slave system in the Americas is very much different than what we see, for the most part, in other cases in slavery throughout the world, throughout history. It's certainly not the only time it has happened, but it seldom ever happens to that degree. And that brings us to PowerPoint question number 2. What do you think, or why do you think such a brutal and repressive form of slavery developed in the Americas? And once more, a lot of you came up with some very good ideas for this. The importance that race played in this, the fact that there was that clear cultural and racial distinction between the two groups, making the enslaved group very easy to distinguish from the more from the rest of kind of colonial American society. All that sort of factors into it and certainly plays into it as well. The importance that enslaved individuals had to the economies of the Americas, and how really kind of the entire economic benefit of these large plantation systems were predicated on a lot of laborers doing things that laborers didn't want to do because it was really, really crappy work. That ultimately leads to why this became such a brutal and oppressive system, because you pretty much had to get people in order to work in those kind of conditions. Also, of course, just the availability, the fact that there were so many individuals and so many kind of kingdoms in Africa that were able to supply such a large amount of individuals to these slave traders. There were enough markets available and enough interest to bring enslaved individuals to the Americas, and that there was a sort of very morbid supply and demand system going on was another reason it becomes so widespread. And ultimately, the fear that these very large, culturally different groups now living within your society, living very close proximity to kind of Euro-American culture, ultimately ends up having. And I think it's really that fear of reprisal, fear of uprising, fear of rebellion from these slaves, which really makes white slave owners and white slave culture become so repressive and so brutal and so harsh, because a lot of times they very much did live in constant fear of an uprising from their own enslaved populations, which, of course, as we will see throughout the semester, does end up happening on a number of occasions. It's not as common, nor are these slave uprisings as successful in the British colonies in North America as they are in some British colonies in the Caribbean and other French and other European colonies in the Caribbean, South America, Latin America, and so forth. So why do you think the Quakers were viewed as dangerous by other religious sects such as the Puritans? Once more, a lot of people have great ideas here, bringing up the fact that the Quakers did not really believe in the same kind of hierarchical structure that a lot of the other religious groups believed in. They were not nearly as male-dominated, and they really did not have the same kind of social pressures on the society that went along with, for example, the Puritans or the Pilgrims, which meant that the Puritans and Pilgrims oftentimes viewed groups such as the Quakers with a lot of suspicion and as potentially dangerous elements because they were not willing to adhere to kind of the same religious structure that the Puritans and the Pilgrims were operating under. Which is relatively ironic because both the Puritans and the Pilgrims really wanted to escape and separate themselves from the power structures of the Anglican Church. So the fact that now in the Americas they were pretty much willing to persecute the Quakers in relatively the same ways that they were being persecuted in England is kind of relatively ironic. But yeah, very good observations here for question number 3. So question number 4, I know it's kind of tricky because I'm sure a lot of you don't have a lot of real detailed economic kind of background to pull off of here to kind of look at some of the differences between mercantilism and our modern economic philosophies. Really, I'd say the biggest difference is the way that trade is perceived. Certainly in both cases, there is still this kind of idea that you want more exports than imports, that a good, favorable trade balance is important. But it's very different from the mercantilist view, which really saw kind of all international trade with anyone you were going to be competing against as being bad or being counterproductive. That pretty much there's only this kind of set amount of resources in the world, and that all these strong powers were competing to snatch up those resources before they were all gone, and you had to try to snatch them up and just hold them to yourself. Obviously, the idea of having to kind of spend money to make money has become a much bigger part of our modern economic philosophies, where governments aren't just trying to hoard as much cash as they can to themselves, that they are now borrowing more money, they're trading more money, and that it's trade and commerce from one nation to another is seen as being mutually beneficial in a lot of cases, and a lot of kind of the business philosophy that goes along with this, and that kind of private corporate or just private enterprises in general are also supposed to be kind of desired. Under mercantilism, most kind of the large corporate structures were supposed to be completely under government control. And they were only supposed to be set up to kind of benefit the nation, and a lot of times could only trade with certain groups, with certain areas, and so forth. That's very much different than our kind of modern philosophy, where pretty much corporate structures are allowed to be globalized institutions, trade with all over the place, and that's generally seen as ultimately bringing more money into a nation than not. Whether or not it's actually functioning in that way, there's still obviously plenty of debate about that. But really, kind of the modern perception of economics has a much smaller role that the government is supposed to directly play in influencing the occurring and the accumulating of hard currency for that country. Question number 5, two of the most significant ways that American colonies changed between 1600 and 1700. Once more, I point out very good aspects as far as the population level, the increased diversity, the importance and role that slavery was playing, and how the kind of economic development in the South becoming such kind of a moneymaker for England really led into that, and how that was going to become one of the reasons why it became such an entrenched institution. The fact that there was this kind of market revolution that was starting to happen during this time period, and a lot more economic functions being taken advantage of in the northern colonies and the middle colonies. All these were very good observations on your part, and really showed that between 1600 and 1700, the American colonies changed in a wide variety of ways, but you still see in each region, New England, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies, some very kind of distinct aspects and avenues as far as what each colony kind of is typified by, how they are kind of making money, making profit, and really who is kind of in charge and who is regulating each of those colonies. Each of them had their own kind of elite group at the top, but who those people were pretty varied, and what their ultimate goals were, and ultimately how that kind of created and led to development in each of these different colonies was fairly important as well. Overall, I was very, very happy with the document exercises from this week. I thought you all did a very good job of analyzing the Trap and Maiden, looking at the South Carolina Slave Code, and coming up with some pretty good examples from the various documents as far as their importance and how they worked. So what were some of the impressions of indentured servitude, in Virginia, does the Trap and Maiden convey, particularly to young women who might have contemplated journeying to North America? In what ways does the song contrast life in Virginia with life in England? Obviously, a lot of people had some great examples here of, right from the document, as far as, this really being kind of a warning to anyone who might have been in England thinking about coming to Virginia, becoming a indentured servant. Just a few good examples that I noticed that people brought up. In brief, I shall declare what I have suffered there, kind of right from the beginning, letting people know that this is not going to be a happy song, or the song is pretty much about all the hardships that this woman had to endure. Then let maidens beware of all my ill fare, once more saying that a warning, saying to take note on what's happening. And then comparisons such as, when she eats meat, then I have none to eat. Upon a bed of straw is where I lay down, full of woe. The axe and the hoe being her undoing. All of these kind of different lines that you guys picked out were very, very good. It's sort of hard to miss in this document. You can almost pick any of the lines, and really kind of repeating the same idea that things were better in England. If you want things a little bit better, stay there. Do not come over to the Americas, to the New World, because as much as a potential you might think you might have, if you come over in the role of domestic servant, you're not going to have a good time. That sort of being the emphasis of what she's talking about. So does the song provide an accurate illustrative portrait of indentured servitude, especially for women in Virginia, and use what you've learned from reading chapters 2 and 3. And I think for the most part, people said that they thought that it did, for a large part, that this role of being a domestic servant was oftentimes fraught with a lot of exploitation, a lot of much harder work, a lot of a dangerous situation, as far as being more susceptible to disease and sickness, and that certainly that most people who came over as domestic servants did not have a very good experience with it. A lot of them ended up leaving after they became domestic servants, did not end up staying in the Americas. But a lot of people also pointed out that this song here was likely just the tip of the iceberg. It certainly does not go into the level of sexual exploitation. For example, the case of Annie Orthwood, which you discussed in the next question down, which was very, very prevalent, something else that certainly should have been a warning to anyone who was considering entering into this kind of an agreement and this kind of arrangement, how it was really once more putting women at a very vulnerable, disenfranchised position, particularly when it comes in relation to that kind of sexual exploitation, which was much more common than what we see, kind of listed or described in this particular document. Going on to number 3, I thought all of you did a really good job with this. You took the story of Annie Orthwood and her experiences, the child, what ultimately ends up happening, and put them into a lot of very well-versed stanzas, I guess is what you'd call it, what the question calls it, that would fit right in with this ballad, and once more serve as just an even bigger warning to anyone not to try to enter into this kind of an arrangement, because once more you're not going to have a good time with it, and there's a lot of risks that a lot of people entering into these probably didn't factor in or didn't think about. But it does serve as a really interesting parallel when you think about the comparison between a document like the Trap-in Maiden and the South Carolina Slave Code. In a lot of cases, painting rather similar picture, where there was going to be very kind of hard and very sort of repressive system for both involved, having very little say in the activities you're going to be doing, in the living conditions and the situations you're going to have to be experiencing. But that, as far as question 5 goes, there are a lot of very key differences that come between indentured servitude and slavery. First of all, a lot of people also did some very good job looking at the slave code and saying that there was something really kind of disturbing about it, something about kind of the complacency that was being written with, the sort of matter-of-fact nature that it was being constructed, and how it was sort of outlining these very kind of harsh, cruel, barbaric practices, but in this kind of very sterile, legalese type way. It is rather offsetting, and I'm glad a couple of people pointed that out, because I would certainly agree with you on that, and I thought something very similar the first times that I read some of these slave codes, how sort of chilling it is to think that people were constructing these kind of harsh laws and rules for fellow human beings is kind of staggering. Obviously, some things you could have really pointed out from the document itself as far as what the differences between indentured servant and slavery would have been. First of all, right up one of the first or second paragraphs, there's this line where it says that all Negroes and Indians, mulattoes and mestizos who are now or shall hereafter be in this province, and all their issue and offspring born or to be born, shall be absolute slaves. So once more, this idea of making a distinction between indentured servants who'd only serve for a set amount of time, and making slavery not just a lifelong institution for black enslaved individuals, but making it hereditary, meaning that any children or offspring, as long as one of the parents was a slave, the child then would be enslaved as well. And once more, this is something that was much different than most institutions of slavery throughout history. Mostly, children would oftentimes be freed. They'd join the dominant culture. They'd be legitimate heirs in certain cases. And that is much different than what we see happening in the Americas, as there was always this very distinction that anyone who had any kind of drop of African American, Black American blood in them was going to be considered part of this subservient or slave group. And ultimately, even when it comes time to go past that, the institution of slavery, those sort of real deep prejudicial leanings are still there. It's known as hypodescent. which is an anthropological term, but pretty much means that the offspring of any kind of mixed group ultimately is placed in kind of the minority category. And that's ultimately something that we still see happening to this day as far as how people are viewed and perceived around culture and so forth. But getting into more into details, you really see a lot of the kind of conditions that the slaves had to follow being much more strict than indentured servants, not being able to leave their plantation without a permit, being able to be stopped and searched by any white person at any point in time to try to find anything going on. Not even an individual from the law, just any white individual could, based on this code, stop a black American, enslaved or not, to search them to see if they have weapons or are doing anything suspicious. Death penalty being imposed for all felonies, including just sabotaging the work, burning the cotton, tobacco, anything like that. Any kind of sabotage being seen that would have an economic detriment to the owners being seen as kind of punishable by death. Of course, any violence, again, it's a white individual not being able to carry firearms without supervision. All of these were examples that certainly indentured servants, for the most part, would not have to put up with. It would not have the same penalties. And once more, this idea that this is one of these mechanisms of social control, and we're going to talk about this more next week, that's being implemented, that even though there were individuals, white indentured servants and black enslaved individuals, working in rather similar roles, that the people who are at the top of society are finding ways to keep these groups separated because they do not want these groups to be able to make common cause, to interact with one another. And if you look at a lot of what the slave code was pertaining to, it's trying to make sure that enslaved black individuals cannot rebel, cannot rise up, and cannot fight back against their white owners, their white masters, as ultimately that is the ultimate fear, like I said earlier, that a lot of them end up having. In the same way they did not have that, certainly there was a lot of animosity and distrust towards servants and indentured servants, but it did not have the same race-based quality, and it did not have the same veracity that you see when it came to talking about enslaved individuals. So that is really where you kind of see a lot of these differences lying. And once more, we're going to talk more about this idea of kind of the social control mechanism being employed during this time period and the importance that that had, not just at the time period, but how in a lot of cases these same ideas and institutions which are being created now still have a kind of ringing impact on our daily lives and the culture and society and the inequalities within the society that we still see all the way up until this day. So I think it's really hard to kind of take a look at the country and the world around us and see a lot of these disparities without being able to kind of trace them back to their beginnings. And that's really what we're going to be talking about a little bit this week, of course, and then going into next week as well. So thank you all very much, and I will be looking forward to seeing your answers to this week's assignments.